rode was falling backward, and he was trying to turn it, beating it about the head with his balled fist. And the bear's long muzzle swung toward them in a stunned articulation, amazed beyond reckoning. Some foul gobbet dangling from its jaws, and its chops dyed red with blood. Glanton fired. The ball struck the bear in the chest, and the bear leaned with a strange moan and seized the Delaware and lifted him from the horse. Glanton fired again into the thick ruff of fur forward of the bear's shoulder as it turned, and the man dangling from the bear's jaws looked down at them, cheek and jowl with the brute, and one arm about its neck like some crazed defector in a gesture of defiant camaraderie. All through the woods a bedlam of shouts, and the whack of men beating the screaming horses into submission. Glanton cocked the pistol a third time, as the bear swung with the Indian dangling from its mouth like a doll, and passed over him in a sea of honey-colored hair smeared with blood, and a reek of carrion, and the rooty smell of the creature itself. The shot rose and rose, a small core of metal scurrying toward the distant beltways of matter, grinding mutely to the west above them all. Several rifle shots rang out, and the beast loped horribly into the forest with his hostage, and was lost among the darkening trees. The Delawares trailed the animal 3 days, while the party moved on. The first day they followed blood, and they saw where the thing had rested, and where the wounds had stanched. And the next day they followed the drag marks through the duff of a high forest floor. And the day after they followed only the faintest trace across a high stone mesa, and then nothing. They cut for sign until dark, and they slept on the naked flints. And the next day they rose and looked out on all that wild and stony country to the north. The bear had carried off their kinsmen like some fabled storybook beast, and the land had swallowed them up beyond all ransom or reprieve. They caught up their horses and turned back. Nothing moved in that high wilderness save the wind. They did not speak. They were men of another time, for all that they bore Christian names, and they had lived all their lives in a wilderness, as had their fathers before them. They'd learned war by warring, the generations driven from the eastern shore across the continent, from the ashes at Janadenhutton onto the prairies, and across the outlet to the bloodlands of the West. If much in the world were mystery, the limits of that world were not, for it was without measure or bound, and there were contained within it creatures more horrible yet, and men of other colors and beings which no man has looked upon, and yet not alien, none of it, more than were their own hearts alien in them, whatever wilderness contained there, and whatever beasts. They cut the trail of the party early the next day, and by nightfall of the day following they had overtaken them. The lost warrior's horse stood saddled in the caballado as they had left it, and they took down the bags and divided his estate among them, and that man's name was never said again. In the evening the judge came to the fire and sat with them and questioned them and made a map upon the ground and scrutinized it. Then he rose and trotted out with his boots, and in the morning all rode on as before. Their way led now through dwarf oak and ilex, and over a stony ground where black trees stood footed in the seams on the slopes. They rode through sunlight and high grass, and in the late afternoon they came out upon an escarpment that seemed to rim the known world. Below them in the paling light smoldered the plains of San Augustine. Stretching away to the northeast, the earth floating off in a long curve silent under looms of smoke from the underground coal deposits burning there 1,000 years. The horses picked their way along the rim with care, and the riders cast varied glances out upon that ancient and naked land. In the days to come, they would ride up through a country where the rocks would crawl, the flesh would be and where other than rock, nothing was. They rode in a narrow enfilade along a trail strewn with the dry, round turds of goats. And they rode with their faces averted from the rock wall and the bake oven air which it rebated. The slant black shapes of the mounted men stenciled across the stone with a definition austere and implacable, like shapes capable of violating their covenant with the flesh that authored them, and continuing autonomous across the naked rock without reference to sun or man or God. They rode down from this country through a deep gorge, clattering over the stones, rifts of cool blue shade. In the dry sand of the arroyo floor, old bones and broken shapes of painted pottery, and graven on the rocks above them pictographs of horse and cougar and turtle, and the mounted Spaniards, helmeted and bucklered and contemptuous of stone and silence and time itself. Lodged in faults and crevices 100 feet above them were nests of straw and jetsam from old high waters, and the riders could hear the mutter of thunder in some nameless distance, and they kept watch on the narrow shape of sky overhead for any darkness of impending rain, threading the canyon's close-pressed flanks, the dry white rocks of the dead river floor round and smooth as arcane eggs. That night, they camped in the ruins of an older culture, deep in the Stone Mountains, a small valley with a clear run of water and good grass. Dwellings of mud and stone were walled up beneath an overhanging cliff, and the valley was traced with the work of old acequias. The loose sand in the valley floor was strewn everywhere with pieces of pottery and blackened bits of wood, and it was crossed and recrossed with the tracks of deer and other animals. The judge walked the ruins at dusk, the old rooms still black with wood smoke, old flints and broken pottery among the ashes, and small dry corn cobs. A few rotting wooden ladders yet leaned against the dwelling walls.
Away from me.
He roamed through the ruinous kivas, picking up small artifacts, and he sat upon a high wall and sketched in his book until the light failed. The moon rose full over the canyon, and there was stark silence in the little valley. It may be it was their own shadows kept the coyotes from abroad, for there was no sound of them, or wind, or bird in that place, but only the light rill of water running over the sand in the dark below their fires. The judge all day had made small forays among the rocks of the gorge through which they passed, and now at the fire he spread part of a wagon sheet on the ground and was sorting out his finds and arranging them before him. In his lap he held the leather ledger book, and he took up each piece, flint or potsherd or tool of bone, and deftly sketched it into the book. He sketched with a practiced ease, and there was no wrinkling of that bold brow or pursing of those oddly childish lips. His fingers traced the impression of old willow wicker on a piece of pottery clay, and he put this into his book with nice shadings and economy of pencil strokes. He is a draftsman as he is other things, well sufficient to the task. He looks up from time to time at the fire, or at his companions in arms, or at the night beyond. Lastly, he set before him the footpiece from a suit of armor, hammered out in a shop in Toledo 3 centuries before. A small steel tapadero, frail and shelled with rot. This the judge sketched in profile and in perspective, citing the dimensions in his neat script, making marginal notes. Glanton watched him. When he had done, he took up the little footguard and turned it in his hand and studied it again. And then he crushed it into a ball of foil and pitched it into the fire. He gathered up the other artifacts and cast them also into the fire. And he shook out the wagon sheet and folded it away among his possibles, together with the notebook. Then he sat with his hands cupped in his lap, and he seemed much satisfied with the world, as if his counsel had been sought at its creation. A Tennessean named Webster had been watching him. And he asked the judge what he aimed to do with those notes and sketches. And the judge smiled and said that it was his intention to expunge them from the memory of man. Webster smiled, and the judge laughed. Webster regarded him with one eye asquint, and he said, "Well, you've been a draftsman somewheres, and them pictures is like enough to things themselves. But no man can put all the world in a book. No more than everything drawed in a book is so." "Well said, Marcus," spoke the judge. "But don't draw me," said Webster, "for I don't want in your book." "My book or some other book," said the judge. "What is to be deviates no jot from the book wherein it's writ. How could it? It would be a false book, and a false book is no book at all." "You're a formidable riddler, and I'll not match words with you. Only save my crusted mug from out your ledger there, for I'd not have it shown about, perhaps, to strangers." The judge smiled. "Whether in my book or not, every man is tabernacled in every other, and he in exchange, and so on in an endless complexity of being and witness to the uttermost edge of the world." "I'll stand for my own witness," said Webster. But by now the others had begun to call to him his conceit. And who would want to see his bloody portrait anyway? And would there be fights break out in the great crowds awaiting its unveiling? And perhaps they could tar and feather the picture, lacking the article itself. Until the judge raised his hand and called for amnesty, and told them that Webster's feelings were of a different kind and not motivated by vanity at all, and that he'd once drawn an old Hueco's portrait and unwittingly chained the man to his own likeness. For he couldn't sleep, for fear an enemy might take it and deface it. And so like was the portrait that he would not suffer it creased, nor anything to touch it. And he made a journey across the desert with it, to where he'd heard the judge was to be found, and he begged his counsel as to how he might preserve the thing. And the judge took him deep into the mountains, and they buried the portrait in the floor of a cave, where it lies yet, for aught the judge knew. When he was done telling this, Webster spat and wiped his mouth, and eyed the judge again. "That man," he said, "was no more than an ignorant heathen savage." "That's so," said the judge. "It ain't like that with me." "Excellent," said the judge, reaching for his portmanteau. "You've no objection to a sketch, then?" "I'll sit for no portrait," said Webster. "But it ain't like you said." The company fell silent. Someone rose to stoke the fire, and the moon ascended and grew small over the ruined dwellings, and the little stream braided over the sands on the valley floor shone like woven metal. And save for the sound it made, there was no sound other. "What kind of Indians has these here been, Judge?" The judge looked up. "Dead ones, I'd say. What about you, Judge?" "Not so dead," said the judge. "They was passable Masons, I'd say that. These niggers hereabouts now ain't no kind." "Not so dead," said the judge. Then he told them another story, and it was this story. In the western country of the Alleghenies, some years ago, when it was yet a wilderness, there was a man who kept a harness shop by the side of the Federal Road. He did so because it was his trade, and yet he did little of it, for there were few travelers in that place. So that he fell into the habit before long of dressing himself as an Indian, and taking up station a few miles above his shop, and waiting there by the roadside to ask whoever should come that way if they would give him money. At this time he had done no person any injury. One day a certain man came by, and the harness maker, in his beads and feathers, stepped from behind his tree and asked this certain man for some coins. He was a young man, and he refused, and having recognized the harness maker for a white man, spoke to him in a way that made the harness maker ashamed, so that he invited the young man to come to his dwelling a few miles distant on the road. This harness maker lived in a bark house he had built, and he kept a wife and 2 children, all of whom reckoned the old man mad, and were only waiting some chance to escape him and the wild place he'd brought them to. They therefore welcomed the guest, and the woman gave him his supper. But while he ate, the old man again began to try to wheedle money from him. And he said that they were poor, as indeed they were, and the traveler listened to him. And then he took out 2 coins, which like the old man had never seen. And the old man took the coins and studied them, and showed them to his son. And the stranger finished his meal and said to the old man that he might have those coins. But ingratitude is more common than you might think, and the harness maker wasn't satisfied, and he began to question whether he ought not perhaps to have another such ornament for his wife. The traveler pushed back his plate and turned in his chair and gave the old man a lecture. And in this lecture, the old man heard things he had once known but forgotten, and he heard some new things to go with them. The traveler concluded by telling the old man that he was a loss to God and man alike, and would remain so until he took his brother into his heart as he would take himself in. And he had come upon his own person in want in some desert place in the world. Now, as he was concluding this speech, there passed on the road a nigger, drawing a funeral hearse for one of his own kind. And it was painted pink, and the nigger was dressed in clothes of every color, like a carnival clown. And the young man pointed out this nigger passing in the road, and he said that even a black nigger... Here the judge paused. He had been looking into the fire, and he raised his head and looked around him. His narration was much in the manner of a recital. He hadn't lost the thread of his tale. He smiled at the listeners about. Said that even a crazy black nigger was not less than a man among men. And then the old man's son stood up and began an oration himself, pointing out at the road and calling for a place to be made for the nigger. He used those words, that a place be made. Of course, by this time the nigger and hearse had passed on from sight. With this, the old man repented all over again, and swore that the boy was right. And the old woman who was seated by the fire was amazed at all she had heard. And when the guest announced that the time had come for his departure, she had tears in her eyes. And the little girl came out from behind the bed and clung to his clothes. The old man offered to walk him out the road so as to see him off on his journey, and to apprise him of which fork in the road to take and which not, for there were scarcely any way signs in that part of the world. As they walked out, they spoke of life in such a wild place, where such people as you saw but one, and never again. And by they came to the fork in the road, and here the traveler told the old man that he had come with him far enough, and he thanked him, and they took their departure, each of the other, and the stranger went on his way. But the harness maker seemed unable to suffer the loss of his company, and he called to him, and went with him again a little way upon the road. And by they came to a place where the road was darkened in a deep wood, and in this place the old man killed the traveler. He killed him with a rock, and he took his clothes, and he took his watch and his money, and he buried him in a shallow grave by the side of the road. Then he went home. On the way, he tore his own clothes and bloodied himself with a flint. And he told his wife they had been set upon by robbers, and the young traveler murdered, and him only escaped. She began to cry, and after a while she made him take her to the place. And she took wild primrose, which grew in plenty thereabout, and she put it on the stones. And she came there many times until she was old. The harness maker lived until his son was grown, and never did anyone harm again.
Here.
As he lay dying, he called the son to him and told him what he had done. And the son said that he forgave him, if it was his to do so. And the old man said that it was his to do so. And then he died. But the boy was not sorry, for he was jealous of the dead man. And before he went away, he visited that place and cast away the rocks and dug up the bones and scattered them in the forest. And then he went away. He went away to the west, and he himself became a killer of men. The old woman was still living at the time, and she knew none of what had passed, and she thought that wild animals had dug the bones and scattered them. Perhaps she didn't find all the bones, but such as she did, she restored to the grave, and she covered them up and piled the stones over them and carried flowers to that place as before. When she was an old woman, she told people that it was her son buried there, and perhaps by that time it was so. Here the judge looked up and smiled. There was a silence, then all began to shout at once with every kind of disclaimer. "He was no harness maker. He was a shoemaker, and he was clear of them charges," called one. And another, "He never lived in no wilderness place. He had a shop dead in the center of Cumberland, Maryland. They never knew where them bones come from. The old woman was crazy, known to be so. That was my brother in that casket, and he was a minstrel dancer out of Cincinnati, Ohio, who was shot to death over a woman." And other protests, until the judge raised both hands for silence. "Wait now," he said, "for there's a rider to the tale. There was a young bride waiting for that traveler with whose bones we are acquainted, and she bore a child in her womb that was the traveler's son. Now this son, whose father's existence in this world is historical and speculative, even before the son has entered it, is in a bad way. All his life he carries before him the idol of a perfection to which he can never attain. The father dead has euchred the son out of his patrimony. For it is the death of the father to which the son is entitled, and to which he is heir, more so than his goods. He will not hear of the small, mean ways that tempered the man in life. He will not see him struggling in follies of his own devising. No, the world which he inherits bears him false witness. He is broken before a frozen god, and he will never find his way. What is true of one man," said the judge, "is true of many. The people who once lived here are called the Anasazi, the old ones. They quit these parts, routed by drought or disease, or by wandering bands of marauders. Quit these parts ages since, and of them there is no memory. They are rumors and ghosts in this land, and they are much revered. The tools, the art, the building, these things stand in judgment on the latter races. And yet there is nothing for them to grapple with. The old ones are gone like phantoms, and the savages wander these canyons to the sound of an ancient laughter. In their crude huts they crouch in darkness and listen to the fear seeping out of the rock. All progressions from a higher to a lower order are marked by ruins and mystery and a residue of nameless rage. So, here are the dead fathers. Their spirit is entombed in the stone. It lies upon the land with the same weight and the same ubiquity. For whoever makes a shelter of reeds and hides has joined his spirit to the common destiny of creatures, and he will subside back into the primal mud with scarcely a cry. But who builds in stone seeks to alter the structure of the universe. And so it was with these masons, however primitive their works may seem to us. None spoke. The judge sat half naked and sweating, for all the night was cool. At length, the ex-priest Tobin looked up. "It strikes me," he said, "that either son is equal in the way of disadvantage. So, what is the way of raising a child?" "At a young age," said the judge, "they should be put in a pit with wild dogs. They should be set to puzzle out from their proper clues the one of 3 doors that does not harbor wild lions. They should be made to run naked in the desert until—" "Hold now," said Tobin. The question was put in all earnestness. "And the answer," said the judge. "If God meant to interfere in the degeneracy of mankind, would he not have done so by now? Wolves cull themselves, man. What other creature could? And is the race of man not more predacious yet? The way of the world is to bloom and to flower and die. But in the affairs of men there is no waning, and the noon of his expression signals the onset of night. His spirit is exhausted at the peak of its achievement. His meridian is at once his darkening and the evening of his day. He loves games. Let him play for stakes. This you see here, these ruins wondered at by tribes of savages. Do you not think that this will be again? Aye, and again. With other people, with other sons. The judge looked about him. He was sat before the fire naked, save for his breeches, and his hands rested palm down upon his knees. His eyes were empty slots. None among the company harbored any notion as to what this attitude implied. Yet so like an icon was he in his sitting that they grew cautious and spoke with circumspection among themselves, as if they would not waken something that had better been left sleeping.
Yeah.
The following evening, as they rode up onto the western rim, they lost one of the mules. It went skittering off down the canyon wall with the contents of the panniers exploding soundlessly in the hot, dry air. And it fell through sunlight and through shade, turning in that lonely void until it fell from sight into a sink of cold blue space that absolved it forever of memory in the mind of any living thing that was. Glanton sat his horse and studied the adamantine deep beneath him. A raven had set forth from the cliffs far below to wheel and croak. In the acute light, the sheer stone wall wore strange contours, and the horsemen on that promontory seemed very small, even to themselves. Glanton looked upward briefly, as if there were anything to ascertain in that perfect china sky, and then he chucked up his horse, and they rode on. Crossing the high mesas in the days to follow, they began to come upon burned-out pits in the ground where the Indians had cooked mescal. And they rode through strange forests of maguey, the aloe or century plant, with immense flowering stalks that rose 40 feet into the desert air. Each dawn, as they saddled their horses, they watched the pale mountains to the north and to the west for any trace of smoke. There was none. The scouts would be already gone, riding out in the dark before the sun rose, and they wouldn't return until night, reckoning out the camp in that incoordinate waste by palest starlight, or in blackness absolute, where the company sat among the rocks without fire or bread or camaraderie any more than banded apes. They crouched in silence, eating raw meat the Delawares had killed on the plain with arrows, and they slept among the bones. A lobe-shaped moon rose over the black shapes of the mountains, dimming out the eastern stars. And along the nearby ridge, the white blooms of flowering yuccas moved in the wind. And in the night, bats came from some nether part of the world to stand on leather wings like dark, satanic hummingbirds and feed at the mouths of those flowers. Farther along the ridge and slightly elevated on a ledge of sandstone squatted the judge, pale and naked. He raised his hand, and the bats flared in confusion. And then he lowered it and sat as before, and soon they were feeding again. Glanton would not turn back. His calculations concerning the enemy included every duplicity. He spoke of ambushes. Even he, in all his pride, could not have believed that a company of 19 men had evacuated an area of 10,000 square miles of every living unit. 2 days later, when the scouts returned in the middle of the afternoon and reported finding the Apache villages abandoned, he would not ride in. They camped on the mesa and made false fires and lay all night with their rifles on that stony heath. In the morning, they caught up the horses and descended into a wild valley strewn with grass huts and the remains of old cook fires. They dismounted and moved among the shelters, frail structures of saplings and weeds stuck into the ground, and bent two at the top to form a rounded hovel over which a few rags of hide or old blankets remained. The grounds were strewn with bones and nappings of flint or quartzite, and they found pieces of jars and old baskets and broken stone mortars and rifts of dried bean pods from the mesquite and a child's straw doll and a primitive one-stringed fiddle that had been crushed and part of a necklace of dried melon seeds. The hovel doors were waist-high and faced the east, and few of the shelters were tall enough to be stood in. The last one that Glanton and David Brown entered was defended by a large and vicious dog. Brown drew his belt pistol, but Glanton stopped him. He dropped to one knee and spoke to the animal. It crouched against the rear wall of the hogan and bared its teeth and swung its head from side to side, the ears flattened alongside its skull. "He'll bite you," said Brown. "Get me a piece of jerky." He crouched, talking to the dog. The dog watched him.
"Okay, my girl."
"You won't man that son of a bitch," said Brown. "I can man anything that eats. Get me a piece of jerky." When Brown came back with the dried meat, the dog was looking about uneasily. When they rode west out of the canyon, it was trotting with a slight limp at the heels of Glanton's horse. They followed an old stone trail up out of the valley and through a high pass, the mules clambering along the ledges like goats. Glanton led his horse and called after the others, and yet darkness overtook them, and they were benighted in that place, strung out along a fault in the wall of the gorge. He led them, cursing upward through the profoundest dark, but the way grew so narrow and the footing so treacherous they were obliged to halt. The Delawares came back afoot, having left their horses at the top of the pass, and Glanton threatened to shoot them all were they attacked in that place. They passed the night, each man at the feet of his horse where it stood in the trail, between a sheer rise and a sheer fall. Glanton sat at the head of the column with his guns laid out before him. He watched the dog. In the morning they rose and went on, picking up the other scouts and their horses at the top of the pass and sending them on again. They rode through the mountains all that day, and if Glanton slept, none saw him do so. The Delawares had reckoned the village empty 10 days, and the Hileños had decamped in small bands by every egress. There was no trail to follow. The company rode on through the mountains single file. The scouts were gone for 2 days. On the third day, they rode into camp with their horses all but ruined. That morning, they'd seen fires atop a thin blue mesa 50 miles to the south. Chapter 12. Crossing the border. Storms. Ice and lightning. The slain Argonauts. The azimuth. Rendezvous. Councils of war. Slaughter of the Hileños. Death of Juan Miguel. The dead in the lake. The chief. An Apache child. On the desert. Night fires. El Virote. A surgery. The judge takes a scalp.
Now, come on.
Un hacendado. Gallego. Ciudad de Chihuahua. For the next 2 weeks, they would ride by night. They would make no fire. They had struck the shoes from their horses and filled the nail holes in with clay. And those who still had tobacco used their pouches to spit in. And they slept in caves and on bare stone. They rode their horses through the tracks of their dismounting, and they buried their stool like cats, and they barely spoke at all. Crossing those barren gravel reefs in the night, they seemed remote and without substance, like a patrol condemned to ride out some ancient curse, a thing surmised from the blackness by the creak of leather and the chink of metal. They cut the throats of the pack animals and jerked and divided the meat. And they traveled under the cape of the wild mountains, upon a broad soda plain, with dry thunder to the south and rumors of light. Under a gibbous moon, horse and rider spancelled to their shadows on the snow-blue ground. And in each flare of lightning, as the storm advanced, those self-same forms rearing with a terrible redundancy behind them, like some third aspect of their presence, hammered out black and wild upon the naked grounds. They rode on. They rode like men invested with a purpose whose origins were antecedent to them, like blood legatees of an order both imperative and remote. For although each man among them was discreet unto himself, conjoined they made a thing that had not been before, and in that communal soul were wastes hardly reckonable, more than those whited regions on old maps where monsters do live, and where there is nothing other of the known world save conjectural winds.
Howdy.
They crossed the Del Norte and rode south into a land more hostile yet.
Concern yourself with.
All day they crouched like owls under the niggard acacia shade and peered out upon that cooking world. Dust devils stood on the horizon like the smoke of distant fires, but of living thing there was none. They eyed the sun in its circus, and at dusk they rode out upon the cooling plain where the western sky was the color of blood. At a desert well they dismounted and drank jaw to jaw with their horses, and remounted and rode on. The little desert wolves yapped in the dark, and Glanton's dog trotted beneath the horse's belly, its footfalls stitched precisely among the hooves. That night they were visited with a plague of hail out of a faultless sky, and the horses shied and moaned, and the men dismounted and sat upon the ground with their saddles over their heads, while the hail leaped in the sand like small loosened eggs, concocted alchemically out of the desert darkness. When they resaddled and rode on, they went for miles through cobbled ice, while a polar moon rose like a blind cat's eye up over the rim of the world. In the night they passed the lights of a village on the plain, but they did not alter from their course. Toward the morning, they saw fires on the horizon. Glanton sent the Delawares. Already the dawn star burned pale in the east. When they returned, they squatted with Glanton and the judge and the Brown brothers, and spoke and gestured, and then all remounted and all rode on. 5 wagons smoldered on the desert floor, and the riders dismounted and moved among the bodies of the dead Argonauts in silence, those right pilgrims nameless among the stones with their terrible wounds, the viscera spilled from their sides, and the naked torsos bristling with arrow shafts. Some by their beards were men, but yet wore strange menstrual wounds between their legs, and no man's parts, for these had been cut away and hung, dark and strange, from out their grinning mouths. In their wigs of dried blood, they lay gazing up with ape's eyes at brother's sun, now rising in the east. Wagons were no more than embers, armatured with the blackened shapes of hoop iron and tires, the red-hot axles quicking deep within the coals. The riders squatted at the fires and boiled water and drank coffee and roasted meat and lay down to sleep among the dead. When the company set forth in the evening, they continued south as before. The tracks of the murderers bore on to the west, but they were white men who preyed on travelers in that wilderness and disguised their work to be that of the savages. Notions of chance and fate are the preoccupation of men engaged in rash undertakings. The trail of the Argonauts terminated in ashes, as told, and in the convergence of such vectors in such a waste, wherein the hearts and enterprise of one small nation have been swallowed up and carried off by another, the ex-priest asked if some might not see the hand of a cynical god conducting with what austerity and what mock surprise so lethal a congruence. The posting of witnesses by a third and other path altogether might also be called in evidence as appearing to beggar chance. Yet the judge, who had put his horse forward until he was abreast of the speculants, said that in this was expressed the very nature of the witness, and that his proximity was no third thing, but rather the prime, for what could be said to occur unobserved.
I'm telling you.
The Delawares went on ahead in the dusk, and the Mexican, John McGill, led the column, dropping from time to time from his horse to lie flat on his belly and skylight the outriders on the desert before them, and then remount again without halting his pony or the company which followed. They moved like migrants under a drifting star, and their track across the land reflected in its faint architecture the movements of the earth itself. To the west, the cloud banks stood above the mountains like the dark warp of the very firmament, and the star-sprent reaches of the galaxies hung in a vast aura above the riders' heads. 2 mornings later, the Delawares returned from their dawn reconnaissance and reported the Heleños camped along the shore of a shallow lake less than 4 hours to the south. They had with them their women and children, and they were many. Glanton, when he rose from this council, walked out on the desert alone and stood for a long time looking out upon the darkness down country. They saw to their arms, drawing the charges from their pieces and reloading them. They spoke in low voices among themselves, although the desert round lay like a great barren plate, gently quaking in the heat. In the afternoon, a detachment led the horses out to water and led them back again. And with dark, Glanton and his lieutenants followed the Delawares out to scout the enemy's position. They'd driven a stick into the ground on a rise north of the camp, and when the angle of the dipper had swung about to this inclination, Toadvine and the Van Diemenlander set the company in motion, and they rode forth south after the others trammeled to cords of rawest destiny. They reached the north end of the lake in the cool hours before dawn and turned along the shore. The water was very black, and along the beach there lay a rack of foam, and they could hear ducks talking far out on the lake. The embers of the encampment's fires lay below them in a gentle curve, like the lights of a distant port. Before them on that lonely strand, a solitary rider sat his horse. It was one of the Delawares, and he turned his horse without speaking, and they followed him up through the brush onto the desert. The party was crouched in a stand of willow a half-mile from the fires of the enemy. They had muffled the heads of the horses with blankets, and the hooded beasts stood rigid and ceremonial behind them. The new riders dismounted and bound their own horses, and they sat upon the ground while Glanton addressed them. "We got an hour, maybe more. When we ride in, it's every man to his own. Don't leave a dog alive if you can help it." "How many is there, John?" "Did you learn to whisper in a sawmill?" "There's enough to go around," said the judge. "Don't waste powder and ball on anything that can't shoot back. If we don't kill every nigger here, we need to be whipped and sent home." This was the extent of their counsel. The hour that followed was a long hour. They led the blindfolded horses down and stood looking out over the encampment, but they were watching the horizon to the east. A bird called. Glanton turned to his horse and unhooded it like a falconer at morning. A wind had risen, and the horse lifted its head and sniffed the air. The other men followed. The blankets lay where they had fallen. They mounted, pistols in hand, saps of rawhide and river rock looped about their wrists like the implements of some primitive equestrian game. Glanton looked back at them and then nudged forth his horse. As they trotted out onto the white salt shore, an old man rose from the bushes where he had been squatting and turned to face them. The dogs that had been waiting on to contest his stool bolted, yapping.
There he is.
Ducks began to rise by ones and pairs out on the lake.
Don't you worry about it, okay?
Someone clubbed the old man down, and the riders put rowels to their mounts and lined out for the camp behind the dogs with their clubs whirling and the dogs howling in a tableau of some hellish hunt. The partisans, 19 in number, bearing down upon the encampment where there lay sleeping upward of 1,000 souls. Glanton rode his horse completely through the first wickiup, trampling the occupants underfoot. Figures were scrambling out of the low doorways. The raiders went through the village at full gallop and turned and came back. A warrior stepped into their path and leveled a lance, and Glanton shot him dead. 3 others ran, and he shot the first 2 with shots so closely executed that they fell together. And the third one seemed to be coming apart as he ran, hit by half a dozen pistol balls. Within that first minute, the slaughter had become general. Women were screaming, and naked children, and one old man tottered forth waving a pair of white pantaloons. The horsemen moved among them and slew them with clubs or knives. 100 tethered dogs were howling, and others were racing crazed among the huts, ripping at one another and at the tied dogs. Nor would this bedlam and clamor cease or diminish from the first moment the riders entered the village. Already a number of the huts were afire, and a whole enfilade of refugees had begun streaming north along the shore, wailing crazily, with the riders among them like herdsmen clubbing down the laggards first. When Glanton and his chiefs swung back through the village, people were running out under the horses' hooves, and the horses were plunging, and some of the men were moving on foot among the huts with torches and dragging the victims out, slathered and dripping with blood, hacking at the dying and decapitating those who knelt for mercy. There were in the camp a number of Mexican slaves, and these ran forth calling out in Spanish and were brained or shot. And one of the Delawares emerged from the smoke with a naked infant dangling in each hand, and squatted at a ring of midden stones, and swung them by the heels, each in turn, and bashed their heads against the stones, so that the brains burst forth through the fontanelle in a bloody spew. And humans on fire came shrieking forth like berserkers, and the riders hacked them down with their enormous knives. And a young woman ran up and embraced the bloodied forefeet of Glanton's warhorse. By now, a small band of warriors had mounted themselves out of the scattered remuda, and they advanced upon the village and rattled a drove of arrows among the burning huts. Glanton drew his rifle from its scabbard and shot the 2 lead horses, and resheathed the rifle and drew his pistol and began to fire between the actual ears of his horse. The mounted Indians floundered among the down and kicking horses, and they milled and circled and were shot down one by one until the dozen survivors among them turned and fled up the lake past the groaning column of refugees and disappeared in a drifting wake of soda ash. Glanton turned his horse. The dead lay awash in the shallows like the victims of some disaster at sea, and they were strewn along the salt foreshore in a havoc of blood and entrails. Riders were towing bodies out of the bloody waters of the lake, and the froth that rode lightly on the beach was a pale pink in the rising light. They moved among the dead, harvesting the long black locks with their knives and leaving their victims raw-skulled and strange in their bloody calls. The loosed horses from the remuda came pounding down the reeking strand and disappeared in the smoke, and after a while they came pounding back. Men were wading about in the red waters, hacking aimlessly at the dead, and some lay coupled to the bludgeoned bodies of young women, dead or dying on the beach. One of the Delawares passed with a collection of heads like some strange vendor bound for market, the hair twisted about his wrist and the heads dangling and turning together. Glanton knew that every moment on this ground must be contested later in the desert, and he rode among the men and urged them on. McGill came out of the crackling fires and stood staring bleakly at the scene about. He had been skewered through with a lance, and he held the stock of it before him. It was fashioned from a sodal stock, and the point of an old cavalry sword, bound at the haft, curved from out the small of his back. The kid waded out of the water and approached him, and the Mexican sat down carefully in the sand. "Get away from him," said Glanton. McGill turned to look at Glanton, and as he did so, Glanton leveled his pistol and shot him through the head. He reholstered the gun and stood his empty rifle upright against the saddle and held it with his knee while he measured powder down the barrels. Someone shouted to him. The horse trembled and stepped back, and Glanton spoke to it softly and patched 2 balls and drove them home. He was watching a rise to the north where a band of mounted Apaches were grouped against the sky. They were perhaps a quarter-mile distant, 5, 6 of them, their cries thin and lost. Glanton brought the rifle to the crook of his arm and capped one drum and rotated the barrels and capped the other. He didn't take his eyes from the Apaches. Webster stepped from his horse and drew his rifle and slid the ramrod from the thimbles and went to one knee, the ramrod upright in the sand, resting the rifle's forestock upon the fist with which he held it. The rifle had set triggers, and he cocked the rear one and laid his face against the cheekpiece. He reckoned the drift of the wind, and he reckoned against the sun on the side of the silver foresight, and he held high and touched off the piece. Glanton sat immobile. The shot was flat and dead in the emptiness, and the gray smoke drifted away. The leader of the group on the rise sat his horse, then he slowly pitched sideways and fell to the ground. Glanton gave a whoop and surged forward. 4 men followed. The warriors on the rise had dismounted and were lifting up the fallen man. Glanton turned in the saddle without taking his eyes from the Indians and held out his rifle to the nearest man. This man was Sam Tate, and he took the rifle and reined his horse so short he nearly threw it. Glanton and the 3 rode on, and Tate drew the ramrod for a rest and crouched and fired. The horse that carried the wounded chief faltered, ran on. He swiveled the barrels and fired the second charge, and it plowed to the ground. The Apaches rained with shrill cries. Glanton leaned forward and spoke into his horse's ear. The Indians raised up their leader to a new mount, and riding double, they flailed at their horses and set out again. Glanton had drawn his pistol, and he gestured with it to the men behind, and one pulled up his horse and leaped to the ground and went flat on his belly, and drew and cocked his own pistol and pulled down the loading lever, and stuck it in the sand, and holding the gun in both hands with his chin buried in the ground, he sighted along the barrel. The horses were 200 yards out and moving fast. With the second shot, the pony that bore the leader bucked, and a rider alongside reached and took the reins. They were attempting to take the leader off the wounded animal in mid-stride when the animal collapsed. Glanton was first to reach the dying man, and he knelt with that alien and barbarous head cradled between his thighs like some reeking outland nurse, and dared off the savages with his revolver. They circled on the plain and shook their bows and lofted a few arrows at him, and then turned and rode on. Blood bubbled from the man's chest, and he turned his lost eyes upward, already glazed, the capillaries breaking up. In those dark pools there sat each a small and perfect sun. He rode back to the camp at the fore of his small column, with the chief's head hanging by its hair from his belt. The men were stringing up scalps on strips of leather whang, and some of the dead lay with broad slices of hide cut from their backs to be used for the making of belts and harnesses. The dead Mexican McGill had been scalped, and the bloody skulls were already blackening in the sun. Most of the wickiups were burned to the ground, and because some gold coins had been found, a few of the men were kicking through the smoldering ashes. Glanton cursed them on, taking up a lance and mounting the head upon it, where it bobbed and leered like a carnival head, and riding up and back, calling to them to round up the caballero and move out. When he turned his horse, he saw the judge sitting on the ground. The judge had taken off his hat and was drinking water from a leather bottle. He looked up at Glanton.
Hey!
It's not him. What's that? The judge nodded. That. Glanton turned the shaft. The head, with its long, dark locks, swung about to face him. Who do you think it is, if it ain't him? The judge shook his head. It's not Gomez. He nodded toward the thing. That gentleman is Sangre Puro. Gomez is Mexican. He ain't all Mexican. You can't be all Mexican. It's like being all mongrel. But that's not Gomez, because I've seen Gomez, and it's not him. Will it pass for him? No. Glanton looked toward the north. He looked down at the judge. You ain't seen my dog, have you? He said. The judge shook his head. Do you intend to drive that stock? Until I'm made to quit. That might be soon. That might be. How long do you think it will take these yahoos to regroup? Glanton spat. It wasn't a question, and he didn't answer. Where's your horse? He said. Gone. Well, if you aim to ride with us, you better be forgetting another one. He looked at the head on the pole. You is some kind of goddamn chief, he said. He nudged the horse forward with his heels and rode out along the water's edge. The Delawares were wading about in the lake, feeling for sunken bodies with their feet. He sat there a moment, and then he turned the horse and rode up through the sacked encampment. He rode warily, his pistol across his thigh. He followed the tracks coming down from the desert where they'd ridden in. When he returned, he had with him the scalp of the old man who had first stood up out of the bushes at dawn. Within the hour, they were mounted and riding south, leaving behind them on the scourged shore of the lake a shambles of blood and salt and ashes, and driving before them 1,000 horses and mules.
Abigail, I sent them all.
The judge rode at the head of the column,
more than one armed guard.
bearing on the saddle before
police?
him a strange, dark child, covered with
As
ash.
far as we can tell,
Part of its hair was burned away,
this way.
and it rode mute and stoic, watching the land advance before it with huge black eyes, like some changeling. The men, as they rode, turned black in the sun from the blood on their clothes and their faces, and then paled slowly in the rising dust until they assumed once more the color of the land through which they passed. They rode all day, with Glanton bringing up the rear of the column. Toward noon, the dog caught them up. His chest was dark with blood, and Glanton carried him on the pommel of the saddle until he could recruit himself. In the long afternoon, he trotted in the shadow of the horse, and in the twilight, he trotted far out on the plain, where the tall shapes of the horses skated over the chaparral on spider legs. By now, there was a thin line of dust to the north, and they rode on into dark, and the Delawares dismounted and lay with their ears to the ground. And then they mounted up, and all rode on again. When they halted, Glanton ordered fires built, and the wounded seen to. One of the mares had foaled in the desert, and this frail form soon hung skewered on a palo verde pole over the raked coals, while the Delawares passed among themselves a gourd containing the curdled milk taken from its stomach. From a slight rise to the west of the camp, the fires of the enemy were visible 10 miles to the north. The company squatted in their blood-stiffened hides and counted the scalps and strung them on poles, the blue-black hair dull and clotted with blood. David Brown went among these haggard butchers as they crouched before the flames, but he could find him no surgeon. He carried an arrow in his thigh, fletching and all, and none would touch it. Least of all would Doc Irving, for Brown called him a mortician and a barber, and they kept their distance one from the other. "Boys," said Brown, "I'd doctify it myself, but I can't get no straight grip." The judge looked up at him and smiled. "Will you do her, Holden?" "No, Davy, I won't. But I tell you what I will do." "What's that?" "I'll write a policy on your life against every mishap save the noose."
Hey,
"Damn you, then." The judge chuckled. Brown glared about him. "Will none of you help a man?" None spoke. "Damn all of you, then," he said. He sat and stretched his leg out on the ground and looked at it, he bloodier than most. He gripped the shaft and bore down on it. The sweat stood on his forehead. He held his leg and swore softly. Some watched, some didn't. The kid rose. "I'll try her," he said. "Good lad," said Brown. He fetched his saddle to lean against. He turned his leg to the fire for the light and folded his belt and held it and hissed down at the boy kneeling there. "Grip her stout, lad, and drive her straight." Then he gripped the belt in his teeth and lay back. The kid took hold of the shaft close to the man's thigh and pressed forward with his weight. Brown seized the ground on either side of him, and his head flew back, and his wet teeth shone in the firelight. The kid took a new grip and bore down again. The veins in the man's neck stood like ropes, and he cursed the boy's soul. On the fourth essay, the point of the arrow came through the flesh of the man's thigh, and blood ran over the ground. The kid sat back on his heels and passed the sleeve of his shirt across his brow. Brown let the belt fall from his teeth. "Is it through?" he said. "It is." "The point? Is it the point? Speak up, man." The kid drew his knife and cut away the bloody point deftly and handed it up. Brown held it to the firelight and smiled. The point was of hammered copper, and it was cocked in its blood-soaked bindings on the shaft, but it had held. "Stout lad, you'll make a shade tree sawbones yet. Now draw her." The kid withdrew the shaft from the man's leg smoothly, and the man bowed on the ground in a lurid female motion and wheezed raggedly through his teeth. He lay there a moment, and then he sat up and took the shaft from the kid and threw it in the fire, and rose and went off to make his bed. When the kid returned to his own blanket, the ex-priest leaned to him and hissed at his ear. "Fool," he said, "God will not love ye forever." The kid turned to look at him. "Don't you know he'd have took you with him? He'd have took you, boy, like a bride to the altar." They rose up and moved on sometime after midnight. Glanton had ordered the fires built up, and they rode out with the flames lighting all the grounds about, and the shadow shapes of the desert brush reeling on the sands, and the riders treading their thin and flaring shadows until they had crossed altogether into the darkness which so well became them. The horses and mules were ranged far out over the desert, and they picked them up for miles to the south and drove them on. The sourceless summer lightning marked out of the night dark mountain ranges at the rim of the world, and the half-wild horses on the plain before them trotted in those bluish strobes like horses called forth quivering out of the abyss. In the smoking dawn, the party, riding ragged and bloody with their baled peltries, looked less like victors than the harried afterguard of some ruined army retreating across the meridians of chaos and old night, the horses stumbling, the men tottering asleep in their saddles. The broached day discovered the same barren countryside about, and the smoke from their fires of the night before stood thin and windless to the north. The pale dust of the enemy, who were to hound them to the gates of the city, seemed no nearer, and they shambled on through the rising heat, driving the crazed horses before them. Mid-morning, they watered at a stagnant pothole that had already been walked through by 300 animals, the riders hazing them out of the water and dismounting to drink from their hats, and then riding on again down the dry bed of the stream and clattering over the stony ground, dry rocks and boulders, and then the desert soil again, red and sandy, and the constant mountains about them thinly grassed and grown with ocotillo and sotel, and the secular aloes blooming like phantasmagoria in a feverland. At dusk, they sent riders west to build fires on the prairie, and the company lay down in the dark and slept while bats crossed silently overhead among the stars. When they rode on in the morning, it was still dark, and the horses all but fainting. Day found the heathen much advanced upon them. They fought their first stand the dawn following, and they fought them running for 8 days and nights, on the plain and among the rocks and the mountains, and from the walls and azoteas of abandoned haciendas, and they lost not a man. On the third night, they crouched in the keep of old walls of slumped mud, with the fires of the enemy not a mile distant on the desert. The judge sat with the Apache boy before the fire, and had watched everything with dark, berry eyes. And some of the men played with it and made it laugh, and they gave it jerky, and it sat chewing and watching gravely the figures that passed above it. They covered it with a blanket, and in the morning the judge was dandling it on one knee while the men saddled their horses. Toadvine saw him with the child as he passed with his saddle, but when he came back 10 minutes later, leading his horse, the child was dead, and the judge had scalped it. Toadvine put the muzzle of his pistol against the great dome of the judge's head. "God damn you, Holden. You either shoot or take that away. Do it now." Toadvine put the pistol in his belt. The judge smiled and wiped the scalp on the leg of his trousers and rose and turned away. Another 10 minutes, and they were on the plain again in full flight from the Apaches. On the afternoon of the 5th day, they were crossing a dry pan at a walk, driving the horses before them, the Indians behind, just out of rifle range, calling out to them in Spanish. From time to time, one of the company would dismount with rifle and wiping stick, and the Indians would flare like quail, pulling their ponies around and standing behind them. To the east, trembling in the heat, stood the thin white walls of a hacienda, and the trees thin and green and rigid rising from it like a scene viewed in a diorama. An hour later, they were driving the horses, perhaps now 100 head, along these walls and down a worn trail toward a spring. A young man rode out and welcomed them formally in Spanish. No one answered. The young rider looked down along the creek where the fields were laid out with acequias, and where the workers in their dusty white costumes stood poised with hoes among the new cotton or waist-high corn. He looked back to the northwest. The Apaches, 70, 80 of them, were just coming past the first of a row of jacales and defiling along the path and into the shade of the trees. The peons in the fields saw them at about the same time. They flung their implements from them and began to run, some shrieking, some with their hands atop their heads. The young Don looked at the Americans, and he looked at the approaching savages again. He called out something in Spanish. The Americans drove the horses up out of the spring and on through the grove of cottonwoods. The last they saw of him, he had drawn a small pistol from his boot and had turned to face the Indians. That evening, they led the Apaches through the town of Gallego, the street a mud gutter patrolled by swine and wretched, hairless dogs. It appeared deserted. The young corn in the roadside fields had been washed by recent rains and stood white and luminous, bleached almost transparent by the sun. They rode most of the night, and the next day the Indians were still there. They fought them again at Encinitas, and they fought them in the dry passes going toward El Saus, and beyond in the low foothills from which they could already see the church spires of the city to the south. On the 21st of July, in the year 1849, they rode into the city of Chihuahua to a hero's welcome, driving the harlequin horses before them through the dust of the streets in a pandemonium of teeth and whited eyes. Small boys ran among the hooves, and the victors in their gory rags smiled through the filth and the dust and the caked blood as they bore on poles the desiccated heads of the enemy through that fantasy of music and flowers. Chapter 13. At the baths, merchants, trophies of war, the banquet, Trias, the ball, North, Coyame, the border, the Hueco tanks, Massacre of the Tiwas. Carizal, a desert spring. The Medanos, an inquest concerning teeth. Nakori, the cantina, a desperate encounter. Into the mountains, a village decimated. Mounted lancers, a skirmish. Pursuing the survivors, the plains of Chihuahua. Slaughter of the soldiers, a burial. Chihuahua, westward. Their progress was swelled by new riders, by boys on muleback and old men in plated hats, and a deputation that took charge of the captured horses and mules and hazed them on through the narrow streets toward the bull ring where they could be kept. The tattered campaigners surged on, some now holding aloft cups that had been pressed upon them, waving to the ladies clustered on the balconies their putrescent hats, and elevating the bobbing heads with those strange half-lidded looks of ennui into which the features had dried. All so hemmed about now by the citizenry that they seemed the vanguard of some ragged uprising, and heralded before by a pair of drummers, one witless and both barefoot, and by a trumpeter who marched with one arm raised above his head in a martial gesture and playing the while. In this manner they passed through the standing portals of the governor's palace, over the worn stone sills and into the courtyard, where the broomed hooves of the mercenaries' shoeless horses subsided upon the cobbles with a curious turtle-like clatter. Hundreds of onlookers pressed about as the dried scalps were counted out upon the stones. Soldiers with muskets kept back the crowds, and young girls watched the Americans with huge black eyes, and boys crept forth to touch the grisly trophies. There were 128 scalps and 8 heads, and the governor's lieutenant and his retinue came down into the courtyard to welcome them and admire their work. They were promised full payment in gold at the dinner to be held in their honor that evening at the Riddle and Stevens Hotel. And with this, the Americans sent up a cheer and mounted their horses again. Old women in black rebosos ran forth to kiss the hems of their reeking shirts and hold up their dark little hands in blessing, and the riders wheeled their gaunted mounts and pushed through the clamoring multitude and into the street. They moved on to the public baths, where they descended one by one into the waters, each more pale than the one before, and all tattooed, branded, sutured, the great puckered scars inaugurated God knows where by what barbarous surgeons across chests and abdomens like the tracks of gigantic millipedes. Some deformed, fingers missing, eyes, their foreheads and arms stamped with letters and numbers as if they were articles requiring inventory. Citizens of both sexes withdrew along the walls and watched the water turn into a thin gruel of blood and filth, and none could take their eyes from the judge, who had disrobed last of all, and now walked the perimeter of the baths with a cigar in his mouth and a regal air, testing the waters with one toe, surprisingly petite. He shone like the moon, so pale he was, and not a hair to be seen anywhere upon that vast corpus. Not in any crevice, nor in the great bores of his nose, and not upon his chest, nor in his ears, nor any tuft at all above his eyes, nor to the lids thereof. The immense and gleaming dome of his naked skull looked like a cap for bathing, pulled down to the otherwise darkened skin of his face and neck. As that great bulk lowered itself into the bath, the waters rose perceptibly, and when he had submerged himself to the eyes, he looked about with considerable pleasure. The eyes slightly crinkled, as if he were smiling under the water like some pale and bloated manatee surfaced in a bog, while behind his small and close-set ear, the wedged cigar smoked gently just above the waterline. By now, merchants had spread their wares all along the clay tiles behind them. Suits of European cloth and cut, and shirts of colored silks, and close-napped beaver hats, and fine Spanish leather boots. silver-headed canes and riding crops and silver-mounted saddles and carven pipes and hideout guns and a group of Toledo swords with ivory hilts and nicely chased blades. And barbers were setting up chairs to receive them, crying out the names of celebrated patrons upon whom they had attended, and all of these entrepreneurs assuring the company of credit on the most generous terms. When they crossed the square attired in their new haberdashery, some with coat sleeves barely past their elbows, the scalps were being strung about the iron fretwork of the gazebo like decorations for some barbaric celebration. The severed heads had been raised on poles above the lampstandards, where they now contemplated with their caved and pagan eyes the dry hides of their kinsmen and forebears, strung across the stone facade of the cathedral and clacking lightly in the wind. Later, when the lamps were lit, the heads in the soft glare of the uplight assumed the look of tragic masks, and within a few days they would become mottled white and altogether leprous, with the droppings of the birds that roosted upon them. This Angel Trias, who was governor, had been sent abroad as a young man for his education, and was widely read in the classics, and was a student of languages. He was also a man among men, and the rough warriors he'd hired for the protection of the state seemed to warm something in him. When the lieutenant invited Glanton and his officers to dine, Glanton replied that he and his men did not keep separate mess. The lieutenant yielded the point with a smile, and Trias had done the same. They arrived in good order, shaved and shorn, and turned out in their new boots and finery. The Delawares strangely austere and menacing in their mourning coats, all together about the table set for them. Cigars were presented, and glasses of sherry poured, and the governor, standing at the head of the table, made them welcome and issued orders to his chamberlain that every need be seen to. Soldiers attended them, fetching extra glasses, pouring the wine, lighting cigars from a wick in a silver holder designed for just that purpose. The judge arrived last of all, dressed in a well-cut suit of unbleached linen that had been made for him that very afternoon. Whole bolts of cloth exhausted, and squads of tailors as well in that fabrication. His feet were encased in nicely polished gray kid boots, and in his hand he held a Panama hat that had been spliced together from two such lesser hats by such painstaking work that the joinery did scarcely show at all. Trias had already taken his seat when the judge made his appearance. But no sooner had the governor seen him than he rose again, and they shook hands cordially, and the governor had him seated at his right, and they at once fell into conversation in a tongue none other in that room spoke at all, saving for random vile epithets drifted down from the north. The ex-priest was sat opposite the kid, and he raised his brows and motioned toward the head of the table with a swing of his eyes. The kid, in the first starched collar he'd ever owned, and the first cravat, sat mute as a tailor's dummy at that board. By now, the table was fully commenced, and there was a tandem run of dishes, fish and fowl and beef and wild meats of the countryside, and a roast shote on a platter, and casseroles of savories and trifles and glacés, and bottles of wine and brandy from the vineyards at El Paso. Patriotic toasts were drunk, the governor's aides raising their glasses to Washington and Franklin, and the Americans responding with yet more of their own country's heroes, ignorant alike of diplomacy and any name at all from the pantheon of their sister republic. They fell to, and they continued to eat until they had exhausted first the banquet and then the larder of the hotel altogether. Couriers were sent abroad through the city to fetch more, only to have this also vanish, and more sent for, until Riddle's cook barricaded the door with his body, and the soldiers in attendance took to simply dumping great trays of pastries, fried meat skins, rounds of cheese, whatever they could find, out upon the table. The governor had tapped his glass and risen to speak in his well-phrased English, but the bloated and belching mercenaries were leering about and were calling for more drink, and some had not ceased to scream out toasts, now degenerated into obscene pledges to the whores of various southern cities. The bursar was introduced to cheers, catcalls, hoisted bumpers. Glanton took charge of the long canvas bag stamped with the state cartouche, and cutting the governor short, he rose and dumped the gold out onto the table among the bones and rinds and pools of spilled drink, and in a brisk drumhead disbursement divided out the pile of gold with the blade of his knife, so that each man was paid his spoken share and no further ceremony to it. A sort of skiffle band had struck up a lugubrious air in one corner of the hall, and first up was the judge, who ushered the players and their instruments into the adjoining ballroom, where a number of ladies who had been sent for sat already about the walls on benches and fanned themselves without apparent alarm. The Americans debouched into the dance hall by ones and twos and by groups, chairs pushed back, chairs pushed over to lie where they fell. Wall lamps and their tin reflectors had been lit all about the room, and the celebrants foregathered there cast conflicting shadows. The scalp hunters stood grinning at the dames, churlish-looking in their shrunken clothes, sucking their teeth, armed with knives and pistols, and mad about the eyes. The judge was in close conference with the band, and soon a quadrille was struck up. A great lurching and stomping ensued, while the judge, affable, gallant, squired first one and then another of the ladies through the steps with an easy niceness. By midnight, the governor had excused himself, and members of the band had begun to slip away. A blind street harpist stood terrified upon the banquet table among the bones and platters, and a horde of lurid-looking whores had infiltrated the dance. Pistol fire soon became general, and Mr. Riddle, who was acting American consul in the city, descended to remonstrate with the revelers and was warned away. Fights broke out. Furniture was disassembled, men waving chair legs, candle stands. Two whores grappled and pitched into a sideboard and went to the floor in a crash of brandy glasses. Jackson, pistols drawn, lurched into the street, vowing to shoot the ass off Jesus Christ, the long-legged white son of a bitch. At dawn, the shapes of insensate topers lay snoring about the floor among dark patches of drying blood. Bathcat and the harpist lay asleep upon the banquet table in one another's arms. A family of thieves were tiptoeing through the wreckage, turning out the pockets of the sleepers, and the remains of a bonfire that had consumed a good part of the hotel's furnishings smoldered in the street before the door. These scenes and scenes like them were repeated night after night. The citizenry made address to the governor, but he was much like the sorcerer's apprentice, who could indeed provoke the imp to do his will, but could in no way make him cease again. The baths had become bordellos, the attendants driven off. The white stone fountain in the plaza was filled at night with naked and drunken men. Cantinas were evacuated as if by fire with the appearance of any two of the company. And the Americans found themselves in ghost taverns with drinks on the tables and cigars still burning in the clay ashtrays. Horses were ridden indoors and out, and as the gold began to dwindle away, shopkeepers found themselves presented with debits scrawled on butcher paper in a foreign language for whole shelves of goods. Stores began to close. Charcoal scrawls appeared on the lime-washed walls. Mejor los indios. The evening streets stood empty, and there were no paseos, and the young girls of the city were boarded up and seen no more. On the 15th of August, they rode out. A week later, a company of drovers reported them investing the town of Coyame, 80 miles to the northeast. The village of Coyame had for some years been laid under annual contribution by Gomez and his band. When Glanton and his men rode in, they were fallen upon as saints. Women ran alongside the horses to touch their boots. and presents of every kind were pressed upon them until each man rode with an embarrassment of melons and pastries and trussed chickens gathered in the bow of his saddle. When they rode out 3 days later, the streets stood empty. Not even a dog followed them to the gates. They traveled northeast as far as the town of Presidio on the Texas border, and they crossed the horses and rode dripping through the streets, a soil where Glanton was subject to arrest. He rode out alone on the desert and sat the horse, and he and the horse and the dog looked out across the rolling scrubland and the barren peppercorn hills and the mountains and the flat brush country and running plain beyond, where 400 miles to the east were the wife and child he would not see again. His shadow grew long before him on the banded wash of sand. He would not follow. He had taken off his hat for the evening wind to cool him, and at length he put it on again and turned the horse and rode back. They wandered the borderland for weeks, seeking some sign of the Apache. Deployed upon that plain, they moved in a constant elision, ordained agents of the actual, dividing out the world which they encountered and leaving what had been and what would never be alike extinguished on the ground behind them. Spectre horsemen, pale with dust, anonymous in the crenellated heat. Above all else, they appeared wholly adventure, primal, provisional, devoid of order. Like beings provoked out of the absolute rock and set nameless and at no remove from their own loomings, to wander ravenous and doomed and mute as gorgons, shambling the brutal wastes of Gondwanaland in a time before nomenclature was, and each was all. They killed wild meat, and they took what they required by way of commissary from the pueblos and estancias through which they passed. One evening, almost within sight of the town of El Paso, they looked off toward the north where the Geleños wintered, and they knew they would not be going there. They camped that night at the Hueco tanks, a group of natural stone cisterns in the desert. The rocks about in every sheltered place were covered with ancient paintings, and the judge was soon among them, copying out those certain ones into his book to take away with him. They were of men and animals, and of the chase, and there were curious birds and arcane maps, and there were constructions of such singular vision as to justify every fear of man and the things that are in him. Of these etchings, some bright yet with color, there were hundreds, and yet the judge went among them with assurance, tracing out the very ones which he required. When he had done, and while there yet was light, he returned to a certain stone ledge and sat a while, and studied again the work there.
Whoa, okay.
Then he rose, and with a piece of broken chert, he scalpeled away one of the designs, leaving no trace of it, only a raw place on the stone where it had been. Then he put up his book and returned to the camp. In the morning, they rode out to the south. Little was said, nor were they quarrelsome among themselves. In 3 days, they would fall upon a band of peaceful Tiwas camped on the river and slaughter them, every soul. On the eve of that day, they crouched about the fire where it hissed in a softly falling rain, and they ran balls and cut patches as if the fate of the Aborigines had been cast into shape by some other agency altogether, as if such destinies were prefigured in the very rock for those with eyes to read. No man stood to tender them a defense. Toadvine and the kid conferred together, and when they rode out at noon the day following, they trotted their horses alongside Bathcat. They rode in silence. "Them sons of bitches ain't bothering nobody," Toadvine said. The Van Diemenlander looked at him. He looked at the livid letters tattooed on his forehead, and at the lank, greasy hair that hung from his earless skull. He looked at the necklace of gold teeth at his chest. They rode on. They approached those wretched pavilions in the long light of the day's failing, coming up from downwind along the south bank of the river where they could smell the wood smoke of the cook fires.
bone dry.
When the first dogs barked, Glanton roweled his horse forward, and they came out of the trees and across the dry scrub with the long necks of the horses leaning out of the dust, avid as hounds, and the riders courting them on into the sun, where the shapes of the women rising up from their tasks stood flat and rigid in silhouette for a moment before they could quite believe in the reality of that dusty pandemoniac pounding down upon them. They stood dumb, barefoot, clad in the unbleached cotton of the country. They clutched cooking ladles, naked children.
The devil's brew.
At the first fire, a dozen of them crumbled and fell. The others had begun to run, old people flinging up their hands, children tottering and blinking in the pistol fire. A few young men ran out with drawn bows and were shot down. And then the riders were all through the village, trampling down the grass wickiups and bludgeoning the shrieking householders.
Indians penned in there like cattle.
Long past dark that night, when the moon was already up, a party of women that had been upriver drying fish returned to the village and wandered howling through the ruins. A few fires still smoldered on the ground, and dogs slank off from among the corpses. An old woman knelt at the blackened stones before her door and poked brush into the coals and blew back a flame from the ashes and began to right the overturned pots. All about her the dead lay with their peeled skulls like polyps bluely wet or luminescent melons cooling on some mesa of the moon. In the days to come, the frail black rebuses of blood in those sands would crack and break and drift away, so that in the circuit of few suns, all trace of the destruction of these people would be erased. The desert wind would salt their ruins, and there would be nothing, nor ghost nor scribe, to tell any pilgrim in his passing how it was that people had lived in this place, and in this place died.
All of a sudden?
The Americans entered the town of Carizal late in the afternoon of the second day following, their horses festooned with the reeking scalps of the Tiwas.
Come on.
This town had fallen almost to ruin. Many of the houses stood empty, and the Presidio was collapsing back into the earth out of which it had been raised, and the inhabitants seemed themselves made vacant by old terrors. They watched the passing of that blood-stained argosy through their streets with dark and solemn eyes. Those riders seemed journeyed from a legendary world, and they left behind a strange tincture like an after-image on the eye, and the air they disturbed was altered and electric. They passed along the ruinous walls of the cemetery, where the dead were trestled up in niches, and the grounds strewn with bones and skulls and broken pots like some more ancient ossuary. Other ragged folk appeared in the dusty streets behind them and stood looking after. That night they camped at a warm spring atop a hill amid old traces of Spanish masonry. They stripped and descended like acolytes into the water while huge white leeches willowed away over the sands. When they rode out in the morning, it was still dark. Lightning stood in ragged chains far to the south, silent. The staccato mountains bespoken blue and barren out of the void. Day broke upon a smoking reach of desert, darkly clouded, where the riders could count 5 separate storms spaced upon the shores of the round earth. They were riding in pure sand, and the horses labored so hugely that the men were obliged to dismount and lead them, toiling up steep eskers where the wind blew the white pumice from the crests like the spume from sea swells, and the sand was scalloped and frailly shaped, and nothing else was there save random polished bones. They were all day among the dunes, and in the evening coming down from the last low sandhills to the plain below among catclaw and crucifixion thorn, they were a parched and haggard lot, man and beast. Harpy eagles flew up screaming from a dead mule and wheeled off westward into the sun as they led the horses out onto the plain. 2 nights later, bivouacked in a pass in the mountains, they could see the distant lights of the city below them. They crouched along a shale ridge in the leeward wall of the gap while the fire sawed in the wind. and they watched the lamps winking in the blue floor of the night 30 miles away. The judge crossed before them in the dark. Sparks from the fire ran down the wind. He took his seat among the scrabbled plates of shale out there, and so they sat, like beings from an older age, watching the distant lamps dim out one by one until the city on the plain had shrunk to a small core of light that might have been a burning tree, or some solitary encampment of travelers, or perhaps no ponderable fire at all. As they rode out through the tall wooden gates of the governor's palace, two soldiers who had been standing there counting them past stepped forward and took Toadvine's horse by the headstall. Glanton passed him on the right and rode on. Toadvine stood in the saddle. Glanton!
We're moving on.
The riders clattered into the street. Glanton, just beyond the gates, looked back. The soldiers were speaking to Toadvine in Spanish, and one held an escopeta on him. I ain't got nobody's teeth, Glanton said. I'll shoot these two fools where they stand. Glanton spat. He looked down the street and he looked at Toadvine. Then he dismounted and led his horse back into the courtyard.
Okay, just
Vámonos, he said.
Sounds good.
He looked up at Toadvine.
You could
Get off your horse.
Find some leads of your own, you know.
They rode out of town under escort 2 days later. Upward of 100 soldiers herding them along the road, uneasy in their varied dress and arms, wrenching their horses about, and booting them through the ford where the American horses had stopped to drink. In the foothills above the aqueduct, they reined to one side, and the Americans filed past and wound up through the rocks and nopal and diminished among the shadows and were gone.
For an asshole.
They rode west into the mountains. They passed through small villages, doffing their hats to folk whom they would murder before the month was out. Mud pueblos that lay like plague towns with the crops rotting in the fields, and what stock not driven off by the Indians wandering at will, and none to herd or tend it. In many villages almost wholly depopulated of male inhabitants, where the women and children crouched in terror in their hovels, listening until the last hoofclop died in the distance. At the town of Nakari, there was a cantina, and here the company dismounted and crowded through the doorway and took tables. Tobin volunteered to guard the horses. He stood watching up and down the street. No one paid him any mind. These people had seen Americans in plenty. Dusty, laggard trains of them, months out of their own country, and half crazed with the enormity of their own presence in that immense and blood-slaked waste. Commandeering meal and meat, or indulging a latent taste for rape among the slow-eyed girls of that country. Now, it was something near to an hour past noon, and a number of workers and tradesmen were crossing the street toward the cantina. As they passed Glanton's horse, Glanton's dog rose up, bristling. They veered slightly and went on. At the same moment, a deputation of dogs of the village had started across the plaza, 5, 6 of them, their eyes on Glanton's dog. As they did so, a juggler leading a funeral rounded the corner into the street. And taking a rocket from among several under his arm, he held it to the cigarillo in his mouth and tossed it into the plaza, where it exploded. The pack of dogs shied and scrambled back, save for 2 who continued into the street. Among the Mexican horses tethered at the bar before the cantina, several shot out a hind leg, and the rest stepped about nervously. Glanton's dog didn't take his eyes from the men moving toward the door. None of the American horses even raised an ear. The pair of dogs that had crossed in front of the funeral procession veered off from the kicking horses and came on toward the cantina. 2 more rockets exploded in the street, and now the rest of the procession had swung into view, a fiddler and a cornet player, leading with a quick and lively tune. The dogs were trapped between the funeral and the animals of the mercenaries, and they halted and flattened their ears and began to sidle and trot. Finally, they bolted across the street behind the pallbearers. These details should have stood the workers entering the cantina in better stead. They had turned, and they stood now with their backs to the door, holding their hats to their chests. The pallbearers passed, carrying on their shoulders a bier, and the watchers could see in her burial dress among the flowers the gray-looking face of a young woman jostling along woodenly. Behind came her coffin, made from rawhide, blacked with lampblack, carried by dark-clad porters and looking much like a rude hide boat. At the rear advanced a company of mourners, some of the men drinking. The old women, in their dusty black shawls, helped weeping over the potholes, and children bearing flowers who looked shyly at the spectators in the street as they passed. Within the cantina, the Americans had no more than seated themselves before a muttered insult from a nearby table brought 3 or 4 of them to their feet. The kid addressed the table in his wretched Spanish and demanded which among those sullen inebriates had spoken. Before any could own it, the first of the funeral rockets exploded in the street as told, and the entire company of Americans made for the door. A drunk at the table rose to his feet with a knife and lurched after them. His friends called after him, but he waved them away. John Dorsey and Henderson Smith, 2 boys from Missouri, were the first into the street. They were followed by Charlie Brown and the judge. The judge could see over their heads, and he raised one hand to those behind him. The bier was just passing. The fiddler and the cornetist were making little bows to each other, and their steps suggested the martial style of the air they played. "It's a funeral," said the judge. As he spoke, the drunk with the knife, now reeling in the doorway, sank the blade deep into the back of a man named Grimley. None saw it but the judge. Grimley put a hand on the rough wood frame of the door. "I'm killed," he said. The judge drew his belt pistol and leveled it above the heads of the men and shot the drunk through the middle of the forehead. The Americans outside the door were all but looking down the barrel of the judge's pistol when he fired, and most of them dove to the ground. Dorsey rolled clear and got to his feet and collided with the workers who'd been paying their respects to the passing cortege. They were putting their hats on when the judge fired. The dead man fell backward into the cantina, blood spouting from his head. When Grimley turned, they could see the wooden handle of the knife protruding from his bloody shirt. Other knives were already in play. Dorsey was grappling with the Mexicans, and Henderson Smith had drawn his bowie and half severed a man's arm with it. And the man was standing with the dark arterial blood spraying between his fingers where he tried to hold the wound shut. The judge got Dorsey to his feet, and they backed toward the cantina with the Mexicans feinting and jabbing at them with their knives. From inside came the uninterrupted sound of gunfire, and the door frame was filling up with smoke. The judge turned at the door and stepped over the several corpses sprawled there. Inside, the huge pistols roared without intermission, and the 20 or so Mexicans who'd been in the room were strewn about in every position, shot to pieces among the overturned chairs and the tables with the fresh splinters blown out of the wood and the mud walls pocked everywhere by the big conical bullets. The survivors were making for the daylight in the doorway, and the first of these encountered the judge there and cut at him with his knife. But the judge was like a cat, and he sidestepped the man and seized his arm and broke it, and picked the man up by his head. He put him against the wall and smiled at him, but the man had begun to bleed from the ears, and the blood was running down between the judge's fingers and over his hands. And when the judge turned him loose, there was something wrong with his head, and he slid to the floor and did not get up. Those behind him had, meanwhile, met with a great battery of gunfire, and the doorway was jammed with the dead and dying, when there was suddenly a great ringing silence in the room. The judge stood with his back to the wall. The smoke drifted through the fog, and the shrouded figures stood frozen. In the center of the room, Toadvine and the kid were standing back to back with their pistols at port like duelists. The judge stepped to the door and shouted across the stacked bodies to the ex-priest, where he stood among the horses with his pistol drawn. "The laggards, priest, the laggards." They'd not have shot men in public in a town so large, but there was no help for it. 3 men were running down the street, and 2 others were legging it across the square. Of other souls abroad, there were none. Tobin stepped from between the horses and leveled the big pistol in both hands and began to fire, the pistol bucking and dropping back, and the runners wobbling and pitching headlong. He shot the 2 in the plaza and swung and shot down the runners in the street. The last one fell in a doorway, and Tobin turned and drew the other pistol from his belt and stepped to the other side of the horse and looked up the street and across the square for any sign of movement there or among the buildings. The judge stepped back from the doorway into the cantina, where the Americans stood looking at each other and at the bodies in a sort of wonder. They looked at Glanton. His eyes cut across the smoking room, his hat lying on a table. He stepped over and got it and set it on his head and squared it. He looked about. The men were reloading the empty chambers in their pistols. "Here, boys," he said. "The string ain't run on this trade yet."
All well?
When they left the cantina 10 minutes later, the streets were deserted. They had scalped the entire body of the dead, sliding about in a floor that had been packed clay and was now a wine-colored mud. There were 28 Mexicans inside the tavern and 8 more in the street, including the 5 the ex-priest had shot. They mounted up. Grimley sat slumped sideways against the mud wall of the building. He did not look up. He was holding his pistol in his lap and looking off down the street, and they turned and rode out along the north side of the plaza and disappeared. It was 30 minutes before anyone appeared in the street. They spoke in whispers. As they approached the cantina, one of the men from inside appeared in the doorway like a bloody apparition. He had been scalped, and the blood was all run down into his eyes, and he was holding shut a huge hole in his chest where a pink froth breathed in and out. One of the citizens laid a hand on his shoulder. "A dónde vas?" he said. "A casa," said the man. The next town they entered was 2 days deeper into the Sierras. They never knew what it was called. A collection of mud huts pitched on the naked plateau. As they rode in, the people ran before them like harried game. Their cries to one another, or perhaps the visible frailty of them, seemed to incite something in Glanton. Brown watched him. He nudged forth his horse and drew his pistol, and this somnolent pueblo was forthwith dragooned into a weltering shambles. Many of the people had been running toward the church, where they knelt, clutching the altar. And from this refuge they were dragged, howling, one by one, and one by one they were slain and scalped in the chancel floor. When the riders passed through this same village 4 days later, the dead were still in the streets, and buzzards and pigs were feeding on them. The scavengers watched in silence while the company picked their way past like supernumeraries in a dream. When the last of them was gone, they commenced to feed again.
Morning, Arthur.
Sometimes I think about...
They went on through the mountains without resting.
Sure
They
does.
trod a narrow trail through a black pine wood by day and by dark, and in silence, save for the creaking of tack and the breathing of the horses. A thin shell of a moon lay capsized over the jagged peaks. They rode down into a mountain town just before day, where there was no lamp, nor watchman, nor dog. In the gray dawn, they sat along a wall waiting for daylight. A rooster called. A door slammed. An old woman came down the lane past the daubed sty walls through the mist, carrying a yoke of jars. They rose up. It was cold, and their breath plumed about them. They took down the poles in the corral and led the horses out. They rode up the street. They halted. The animal sidled and stamped in the cold. Glanton had reined up and drawn his pistol. A company of mounted troops passed out from behind a wall at the north end of the village and turned into the street. They wore tall shakos faced with metal plates and horsehair plumes, and they wore green coats trimmed with scarlet and scarlet sashes, and they were armed with lances and muskets, and their mounts were nicely caparisoned, and they entered the street sidling and prancing, horsemen riding upon horses, all of them desirable young men. The company looked at Glanton. He holstered the pistol and drew his rifle. The captain of the Lancers had raised his saber to halt the column. The next instant, the narrow street was filled with rifle smoke, and a dozen of the soldiers lay dead or dying on the ground. The horses reared and screamed and fell back upon each other, and men were unhorsed and rose up struggling to hold their mounts. A second fire tore through their ranks. They fell away in confusion. The Americans drew their pistols and booted their horses forward up the street. The Mexican captain was bleeding from a gunshot wound in the chest, and he stood in the stirrups to receive the charge with his saber. Glanton shot him through the head and shoved him from his horse with his foot and shot down in succession 3 men behind him. A soldier on the ground had picked up a lance and ran at him with it, and one of the riders leaned down out of that wild melee and cut his throat and passed on. In the morning dampness, the sulphurous smoke hung over the street in a gray shroud, and the colorful lancers fell under the horses in that perilous mist, like soldiers slaughtered in a dream, wide-eyed and wooden and mute. Some among the rear guard had managed to turn their mounts and start back up the street, and the Americans were clouting back with pistol barrels the riderless horses, and the horses surged and milled with the stirrups kicking out, and they trumpeted with their long mouths and trampled underfoot the dead. They beat them back and urged their horses through and up the street to where it narrowed and turned up the mountain, and they fired after the fleeing lancers as they skeltered up the trail in a rattle of small stones. Glanton sent a detachment of 5 men to follow, and he and the judge and Bathcat turned back. They met the rest of the company riding up, and they turned back, and they went down and looted the bodies where they lay in the street like dead bandsmen. And they smashed their muskets against the walls of the houses and broke their swords and lances. As they rode out, they met the 5 scouts returning. The Lancers had quit the trail and scattered through the woods. 2 nights later, camped on a butte looking out over the broad central plain, they could see a point of light out on that desert, like the reflection of a single star in a lake of utter blackness. They took counsel. On that raw tablestone, the flames of their bale fire swirled and circled, and they studied the arrant blackness under them, where it fell away like the sheer cloven face of the world.
Grimshaw keeping off your back?
How far do you make them?
Well,
Said Glanton.
just keep your head down.
Holden shook his head.
Okay then.
They've made half a day on us. They number no more than 12, 14. They won't send men ahead. How far are we from Chihuahua City? 4 days, 3. Where's
How you
Davy?
doing, my dear friend?
Glanton turned. How far to Chihuahua, David?
How I look.
Brown stood with his back to the
Not so
fire.
well, my guess.
He nodded.
And mine.
If that's them, they could be there in
I'm
3
sorry,
days.
Hosea.
Why?
You reckon we can overhaul them? I don't know.
For selfish reasons.
Might depend on whether they figure us to be after them.
Yeah.
Glanton turned and
But
spat
you
into the
like a
fire.
father to me.
The judge raised
help me
one
so
pale
much.
and naked arm
Not just with
and
the
pursued
reading,
something
but
in the pit of it with his fingers.
with the living.
If we can be off this mountain by daylight, he said, I believe we can overtake them. Otherwise, we had better make for Sonora.
Jack's gonna
They
be
may
fine,
be from
you'll
Sonora.
Fine.
Then we'd better go get them.
We can only
We could take these scalps to
trying to
Urus.
see a little sense we might be able to
The
make a
fire
proper
swept along the
family
ground.
reunion.
It rose again.
Well, we both know that ain't
We'd
gonna
better go
happen.
get them, said the
never know.
judge. They rode onto the plain at dawn, as the judge had said, And that night they could see the fire of the Mexicans reflected in the sky to the east, beyond the curve of the earth.
My family, well, you know.
All the day following they rode, and all that night, jerking and lurching like a deputation of spastics as they slept in their saddles.
Getting ready.
On the morning of the third day, they could see the riders before them on the plain in silhouette against the sun. And in the evening, they could count their numbers struggling upon that desolate mineral waste.
I reckon all of us is
When the sun rose, the walls of the city stood pale and thin in the rising light 20 miles to the east. They sat their horses. The lancers were strung out along the road several miles to the south of them. There was no reason for them to stop, and no hope in it any more than there was in the riding. But as they were riding, they rode, and the Americans put their horses forward once again. For a while they rode almost parallel toward the gates of the city, the two parties bloody and ragged, the horses stumbling. Glanton called out to them to surrender, but they rode on. He drew his rifle. They were shambling along the road like dumb things. He pulled up his horse, and it stood with its legs spread and its flanks heaving, and he leveled the rifle and fired. They were, for the most part, no longer even armed. There were 9 of them, and they halted and turned, and then they charged across that intermittent ground of rock and scrub and were shot down in the space of a minute.
I never did like her very much.
The horses were caught and herded back to the road, and the saddles and trappings cut away. The bodies of the dead were stripped, and their uniforms and weapons burned, along with the saddles and other gear. And the Americans dug a pit in the road and buried them in a common grave. The naked bodies with their wounds, like the victims of surgical experimentation, lying in the pit, gaping sightlessly at the desert sky as the dirt was pushed over them. They trampled the spot with their horses until it looked much like the road again, and the smoking gunlocks and saber blades and girth rings were dragged from the ashes of the fire and carried away and buried in a separate place. And the riderless horses hazed off into the desert. And in the evening the wind carried away the ashes, and the wind blew in the night and fanned the last smoldering billets, and drove forth the last fragile race of sparks, fugitive as flint strikings in the unanimous dark of the world. They entered the city haggard and filthy, and reeking with the blood of the citizenry for whose protection they had contracted. The scalps of the slain villagers were strung from the windows of the governor's house, and the partisans were paid out of the all but exhausted coffers. And the Sociedad was disbanded, and the bounty rescinded. Within a week of their quitting the city, there would be a price of 8,000 pesos posted for Glanton's head. They rode out on the North Road, as would parties bound for El Paso. But before they were even quite out of sight of the city, they had turned their tragic mounts to the west, and they rode infatuate and half-fawned toward the red demise of that day, toward the evening lands and the distant pandemonium of the sun.
Stop being an idiot.
Chapter 14.
I'd apologize.
Mountain
but
storms.
Don't feel like it.
Tierras quemadas, tierras despobladas. Jesus Maria. The inn. Shopkeepers. A bodega. The fiddler. The priest. Las animas. The procession. Cazando las almas. Glanton takes a fit. Dogs for sale. The judge prestidigitant. The flag. A shootout. An exodus. The conducta. Blood and mercury.